Welcome back. And we're going to get started with our first panel of the day. And I'm going to let Leigh make the introduction. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marian. Just briefly, I realized that at the beginning of my conversation with Nazmul, I introduced him, but not myself. My name's Leigh Hafrey. I'm class of 73, board member with Class Act, and I teach ethics and leadership at MIT Sloan. And I am delighted to have had the conversation with Nazmul, to continue it, but also to do so with two additional participants in the day's activities. Hélène Benveniste is a postdoctoral fellow with the Harvard University Center for the Environment and the Salata Institute as well. Hélène uses both quantitative and qualitative methods drawn from the political and other social sciences to talk about the impacts of climate change and possible responses to it. Diego Osorio, fellow at the Weatherhead Center, advisor to the Canadian government on climate issues. My previous conversation with Diego indicates strong interest in security issues, and that is going to factor into the conversation that we have over the next hour and a half. I would say, too, and the questions, Nazmul, that you received at the end of our first session together addressed a broad range of issues, which I hope this panel can address as well. So, Hélène, I know that your interest in population movements, so migration, and the political and social implications of those migrations is at the forefront of the work that you're doing. Diego, at some level, you respond to the same, but broader responses to climate change will be the subject of the conversation. So let's start with the two of you heard what Nazmul had to say. You heard the questions that people asked for the last 15 minutes. How do you factor all of that material into your preoccupations with specific aspects of climate change and responses to it? Hélène?
Sure. Thank you for having me. One of the things that stood out to me in the previous panel that was really wonderful was that what I think Nazmul showed really was that, you know, whether climate change effects or the interventions to try and deal with it don't really happen in a void. They happen in a socioeconomic context that's there, and that you need to take into account to have solutions that are going to be effective. And so in the case that you mentioned, Nazmul, it was about how, you know, large swaths of the population in Bangladesh, definitely at the time, were lacking access to electricity, and providing green solutions to that was kind of, you know, achieving two goals in one project. And I think that's kind of generally how I tend to think about this issue. I think a lot about effects of climate change on migration, for which Bangladesh is really a very relevant example. Nazmul mentioned it's a very highly densely populated country, about a third of which is directly exposed to coastal flooding that is expected to increase with state of a rise. So we are already seeing population movements for a variety of reasons in the case of Bangladesh. And a lot of what my work and a lot of people's work is trying to do is to try and understand how increased effects of climate change, including through coastal flooding, but not only, might change those migration patterns, but that would not just happen because of climate change. Those migration patterns happen for a variety of reasons. So typically, a lot of people in Bangladesh might end up moving to Dhaka at some point or another, the capital city, not because it's a place that's less exposed to coastal flooding. Actually, in many cases, it's a place that might be more exposed than where they came from, but Dhaka is a place where people are hoping to get economic opportunities for job access and whatnot. And so you have to think about solutions to dealing with climate change effects that are going to take into account the fact that people make all kinds of decisions for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with those climate change effects. And sometimes those decisions might act kind of counter to what you might think the solution would be, just thinking about climate change. And I think Nazmul example really reflected on that, and hopefully we can have more examples that we can discuss later on as well.
Thank you, Hélène. Diego.
Yes. First, if you allow me, I just want to say that although I work for the Canadian government, what I'm saying here, I'm saying in a private capacity. Just wanted to mention two things. Is that I'm here because despite climate change. It was too windy to drive, it was too windy to fly, it was too windy to take the bus. I managed to come here regardless, and even almost crashing in the process of flying. So climate change zero, Diego one, I'm happy to say that. The other thing is that I wanted to thank you, and referring to the class of 73 is something that is relevant for me because it's at the same time part of the solution. You are a unique group of social capital. You are building resilience. You are facilitating this kind of engagement. And this is essential because it connects to what they're doing as well. So let me just mention my answers to what you asked here. Climate change and adaptation and mitigation are the two kind of leverages that we use. And a lot of the population in the planet that are going to be facing the brunt of climate change, the most difficult situations, are those that live in a situation of high vulnerability and very low resilience. You can do an implementation of a climate change transition project with the proper funding, Green Climate Fund and all these things, in a city like Medellin, Colombia, middle income, OCDE levels, et cetera, et cetera. It's not the same to do it in a place where the fragility and the risk for investment makes it very difficult for the private sector to get in. So you need the public-private partnership. You need the public side to pave the road, to take the hit, so that the financials on the private can come and do their magic. That doesn't happen all the time, and the governance, the financial, the frameworks of multilateral management for most of these things are not really up to the task if we really consider the speed, the level, and the extension of the problems. We don't have a governance system that is capable of handling what is going to hit us in the real scale of what it is. So I would say most of the language that you hear at the COP20s on climate change, or the COP10s in biodiversity, or the COPs 10 as well in the kind of desertification convention, is all about adaptation and mitigation. Let's do this, let's do that. But we are past the moment in which we can have remedial action to bring change. We actually have to engage in a necessary course of action to ensure survival. And that implies a major change in the speed. The other element that when I talk about the interface of climate change, peace, and security, the kind of funding that is presented by my colleagues here is essential, because we do live in a system in which funding, risk, quantification is what makes resources move from point A to point B. Funding in fragile contexts is extremely difficult to come by. It's extremely difficult to generate it, and it's very problematic as well to ensure that it stays. So what can we do in situations like that? What can we do in a place where, for instance, when we refer to the change of displacement, the funding allocations are based on a system in which the valuation of property has something to do how people can get a loan or a microloan. But at the same time, you cannot valuate a house that all the insurance companies know that is worth zero or minus zero at this point, because they know that this house is going to be underwater or something else. That's very problematic. I want to mention one thing in terms of the kind of mismatching of the frameworks that we have in place, and this is something that is relevant for funding public-private partnership, but it's also relevant for security. One of the major pockets of action muscle, if I can call it, is the Green Climate Fund. It's a lot of money for climate change, for climate transition, et cetera, et cetera. The fiduciary, the institutional, the verification, the very needed verification frameworks that are needed to spend $1 through that makes it very difficult to actually get that money and make it work in places where you don't have this capacity. I was a trust fund manager with the World Bank, and we realized that at one point in certain places you had to have different authorities, different frameworks to spend the money, because if you do it in a normal World Bank way, it wouldn't work. Climate Green Fund works a little bit in the same way. You won't get $1 stolen in that system, but you might not spend it on the speed that you need to spend it. And on that, bravo, because his institution has been able to develop one of the places in the world, one or two if I understand correctly, that allow you to spend this money quickly and that allows people to have access to it. So I would really encourage you to say that, because if he was able to do it for people in Bangladesh, that's the kind of framework and implementation processes that we need to multiply and accelerate in other places, so that you have green climate funding in different parts of the world when we have to deal with fragile state situations. And fragility is a place where you might not have access to normal loans, you might not have access to normal money, you might not have access to normal anything. And those are the ones who are facing most of the problems. So
Thank you, Diego. Listening to you, and coming back, Kimball, to your question during at the end of our conversation earlier, Nazmul, to what extent does Bangladesh represent a unique case of success that will not easily replicate elsewhere? And then we can talk about the elsewheres.
So, as probably I mentioned during my talk, also that no single solution fits all. We can only probably take examples from success stories and try to see what element could make sense in some other part of the world. So, in the context of Bangladesh, I believe what really worked out, especially for a clean energy transition, is the underlying need first. So there was a need, and there was a socio-economic demand that was there due to having no electricity in 70% of the country at that point in time when it started. And over the years, to support this framework, we had government policies which were supportive. We were affordability of people, which increased, and we had the general drop in technology prices in the clean energy space. So I think all of these were favorable towards the transition of the country. Now, if compared to this, a country which is already supported by a lot of fossil fuel technology, for them, transition would need a lot of sunk cost. Yeah, they need to discard the existing investment. They need to, if those are supported by or developed by the private sector, need to compensate them and then to start fresh.
Right.
So that would be very different than what we started with. Yeah.
Right. So this is the transition that Dustin was talking about. That's going to be extremely difficult in many cases, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, but you're an optimist. You've already announced that, right? How do you see other countries, other groups making that transition, drawing on or perhaps moving beyond the Bangladesh model?
So the immediate countries where I see the Bangladesh model would be very attractive would be the countries which are in a position still the way that we had 20 years back. And I referred probably sub-Saharan Africa to you at some point where they still have 600 million people outside the grid. So for them, it will be probably something they can look into immediately. And I also mentioned at some point that we are now having physical presence in some of those countries to support them doing so. But for other countries, especially the OECD countries or the rich countries, that transition will have to be supported by environmental commitment. And I think they can afford to do so because they are OECD countries. And they were at some point responsible for most of the pollution. I believe it's also a moral obligation to do so at some point in time. So
I teach ethics that touches on morals. I'm not sure. It's something to discuss.
Yeah.
Diego, did you want to get in?
Yeah,
on
I
this
just
point?
wanted to say one thing, which is you're asking how is this possible and how could it be replicated? And the thing is that we have to really, to a certain degree, think outside the box or look at the whole situation with new eyes. Part of the way to replicate these solutions, which in my eyes are positive deviances that need to be understood properly and be able to multiply in other places, is that we need a proper social tissue that allows to have this thing flowing from one place to the other. And this is a conference where you're just not listening to an interesting case of situations. You are making sure that this flow happens. Because when I heard about his own engagement, I wrote to a friend of mine who was part of my class here at the Kennedy School in 2009, and I said, who is doing financing in Colombia right now? I need to know because I have somebody in Bangladesh who knows the secret sauce of how to unlock green climate fund changes, right? That couldn't have happened without this particular point of connection. And this is what I'm referring to having proper social capital. And we need to ensure that the communication flows, that the capacities are understood. And that's something that in this case happens through this particular connection, but we need to make sure that it happens at every level, local levels and stuff like that. I'm talking today to the very famous class of 73. Next week, I'm going to be talking to the class of 2024. And that is quite unique, but it's also important to ensure that we take agency on these kind of engagements and know your role as well, which is congrats.
So I get the sense that then you want to get in on at this point. Please go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of to get to the point of the OECD countries and how those dynamics might play out slightly differently in countries where, infrastructures are already in place, and it's not about bringing very much needed infrastructures, which now, given the market dynamics, we can do very affordably with green energy. It's about changing a whole existing infrastructure. And there, what Nazmul was saying, which is very true, which is, in essence, we have the money. The question is really much more about political will. And there, to what extent one example can translate to another is something that I'm still struggling with, honestly. It's not, a lot of those dynamics are very context specific. So one of the cases that I know quite well is the case of Germany, which was arguably at the origin of a large part of the decrease in green energy costs, a decade or two ago. And Germans in the 2010s accepted an increase in electricity prices that the government had deemed necessary to, fund the increase in renewable energy in the German grid. That was really substantial. I mean, we're talking about 30% increase for the private consumers, which is a big increase, even though, Germans don't have air conditioning. So the amount of electricity that they consume might be slightly different to a US household. But we're talking about significant increase, and we're seeing for quite a few years, for poll after poll after poll, people being really supportive of this increase in prices, which, from a political science standpoint, is really puzzling. Why would people support such a big increase in their electricity prices? And when we were talking with, German experts there, one of the big things that came out of it was that, the energy transition was really being seen as a whole of society project. Everybody was buying in, different political parties had different ways of reaching that, but there was no question that the whole of society wanted to go in this direction. And then there were questions about exactly how we would want to do that. Now, how do we reach that stage? I think that's really the question that we want to ask. And again, I think Diego is making a really important point, which is that, groups of civil actors like yourselves are really helpful in bringing about what really can be described as a change of norms within a given country. In a place like the US, that's really something that I'd be hoping for.
It seems to me, Hélène, that we're talking, and again, Kimball offered us the term technocratic to the conversation we're having. And yet you specifically in your work are interested not in the technocrats, but in the people in villages, in towns, in rural settings who are moving because, or are finding themselves impeded from moving because of climate change. What voice do they have in these conversations?
Very little at this point, with a caveat that if you think about what voice do they have in international climate negotiations, for instance, that has been kind of the positive anomaly that we've seen in the history of international relations, where most renewable countries, such as Bangladesh, but one of the big coalition of countries that has had a very big voice in that stage has been the small island developing states, which are a coalition of countries that have very few people, if you look at the scale of the globe, but has been able to have an outsized influence, not saying it's a bad thing, I'm saying given the number of people they represent, have had an outsized influence in those climate negotiations because they are at the forefront of climate effects. And so I'm being hopeful that in some stages, at least, people who are, facing the brunt of the effects are having a voice. But that's not something that's necessarily systematic, and that's something that, again, is speaking really well to what Nazmul was saying about, the importance of bottom-up approaches. You need to build solutions around the ways people are already living or the ways people want to live. Because if you don't, solutions are not really going to be solutions.
Doesn't stick, yeah.
Maladaptation or however you want.
May I say one thing on that? In Quebec, we have a socialized healthcare system. So the government pays for everything. But we don't have enough money, so they don't have enough ambulance right now. And the solution of the government has been to ensure that everybody gets training on first aid, so that if the ambulance don't come, you know how to respond. That is self-reliance, in a way. And that is a bit of an analogy for what we're trying to achieve here at the level of local communities. Basically, if the solution is not created, handled, and implemented at the local level, is not going to stick and is not going to be sustainable. The important thing is that it's not just knowing how, but having the means to do it and how we bring that capacity. If you look at everything that's being decided at the international level, at every level of the international governance on climate change, civil society is basically watching. But most of it is built on the idea of diplomatic representatives. But that's not the framework that is going to allow us to ensure a whole buy-in, a whole framework. People need to be part of the decision. And so it happens, for instance, that when you go to a COP, you have the blue zone and you have the negotiation zone. And all the civil society talks in the blue zone and the whole thing, and everybody is inside, they are deciding on their behalf. But at the same time, whatever they decide, unless people and communities of practice and villages are represented and are being putting the input in there, it's really not going to be viable. It's an important thing. Everybody needs to know how to do it, and everybody needs to be part of the decision.
So maybe I'll just add one point here. I think there are already so many great examples globally in terms of how regulation can help this green transition. You mentioned about the European, probably the energy trading system, the cap and trade system here. So there are good examples there where regulation can really impact towards a greener transition. But other than regulation, there are also so many voluntary things that's happening and can make real great change in our lives. I'll just give you one example. We all know H&M, the big Swedish, right? Is it Swedish? Anyway, so it's a big brand, so that you know. So we are one of their major producing countries. So I believe we do like 80% of H&M product in Bangladesh. So they came up with this corporate net zero emission policy and essentially required all the garments industry that they export from in our country to go green. So, so without any regulation in place, all the industries went for going rooftop solar installation, reducing their energy intensity, reducing discharge, water discharge. So without any real regulation in place, just by the requirement and for some of the companies, probably slightly premium pricing, but that really didn't made a major change. But I think this kind of intervention, the voluntary intervention, while the regulation is not in place, not just creates a very good ethical value proposition for the companies themselves, could be good for their product demand as well, good consumer feedback, but also can make a real-time change towards the green energy transition in many countries. So just an example that I thought I would share.
And do you have any inside knowledge of how H&M came to that decision and negotiated it with the government of Bangladesh or with this individual suppliers? How did that happen?
So I think that was part of H&M's corporate policy. They would like to go green in terms of, we all probably are familiar with this scope 3 emission. So which is on the supply level, they would like to reduce emission. So I don't think government had any role to play, because they were pure private sector contract between H&M and a private sector manufacturing company back in Bangladesh, but purely driven by their corporate agenda. So they put on a priority list in terms of ordering. So those who scored higher marks, or they term them more like their platinum suppliers, they had the first right of refusal in terms of their production plan. So naturally, there was a generic interest among all their manufacturers to go green so that they can elevate towards that scale of priority.
Right. Yeah. So I actually have two questions, one for you, Diego, and one back for something you said earlier, Hélène. Diego, you have introduced the civil sector. We've been talking public-private partnerships. It's not public-private civil sector, but now it is. So what is the civil sector component to public-private partnerships? Is there one? Should there be one? How would it happen if it isn't happening? And then I'll come to you.
Everybody who lives in a society is part of that civil sector at one point. 9 to 5, you might be private, but after that, you go home, you pay taxes, you have the garbage collected, you care about what school your kids go. That's civil sector. That's the social capacity that we have. It's a social tissue, if you want to put it that way. Now, what role do they have? We have created mechanisms that don't take that into account very well. And because when we talk about public element of the public-private partnership, we mostly refers to governments, you know. Right. And governments function on a very interesting scale. If we're lucky, there are electoral governments, and they have a cycle of 4 to 5 years. And so they can go back and forth and it's zigzagging towards the objective. If it's not that good and it's an authoritarian government, well, it might go straight, but it doesn't go necessarily in the right direction. And so that's a problem that we have to deal with. If you have a civil society, a vibrant, capable, and outspoken civil society, you can ensure that that zigzagging is reduced to the minimum and that you get to the objective. If you get out of the Paris Agreement every 4 years and come back the next 4, we're not going to get anywhere. So that's one element. The second is that we have to do it in a way in which we accept reality. I was talking to a gentleman here about the fact that we are past the 1.5. I mean, let's face it, it's not going to be 2 or something. We have to look at a situation in which this whole discussion, which is handled from the perspective of development, transitions, climate change, and all these things, we take it as if it's something that's going to happen at one point, but we have control on it. We don't. We don't. So we really need to move from the framework of development talking to action remedial talking. And it's a matter of survival for all of us. Some of us are going to survive well. Some of us are going to have it less nicely. And in both cases, we're going to suffer a little bit. So might as well take action in a way that we all have a capacity to respond. Agency is essential. So it goes through the funding. It goes through the capacity of a city in Cambridge. You know, I was looking at the biking paths that you have in this city. Amazing. I mean, it's the best practice that you can have, and it shows a lot of what the Dutch are doing. But you go to the next city around, and it doesn't have the same kind of viability. So what's the point of having a bike if you can only bike in Cambridge, right? This is the kind of scale effects that we need to achieve in different elements. And it goes through a vital civil society, which is the big definition of the public sector, private sector.
Okay. So you're subsuming civil society under the public piece of this. Right?
If you want your government to go one way, vote for it and to make sure that it goes the way you want it.
Have to sort that through. But yeah, the way you've set this up brings me back to you, Hélène, and your praise of the German people, and implicitly,
I don't know if I praised,
implicitly the larger culture. And you know, as I listened to you, I heard so humanity is progressing, albeit reluctantly, in the right direction. But to what extent is this culturally specific? That is, the Germans understood over a period of time that the good of society required them to accept or to endorse higher electrical costs, right?
Yeah, so I wouldn't make the claim that the reason that pushed German society to vote that way, or at least answer public opinion polls that way, was because of a German specific interest for the greater good. I don't think that's the argument I'm making. The argument I was trying to make is there is each country, each region really has a social identity. You have an identity as an individual, you have an identity as part of a group, you have a national identity potentially, and that, the set of values that people have, whether as an individual or as a group, are going to strongly inform what people are willing to support beyond the pure, cost-benefit analysis that we try to make economic decisions based on. And that rationality is very important, but in many cases, people don't make decisions that are purely rational. In the case of migration decisions, which is something that I look at, people, often, if you look at the problem from the outside, you're thinking, oh, the greater physical risk, the greater, the people are going to have incentives to move. Well, yes and no, because when people make decisions to decide to migrate, what they're going to do, what are they going to base their decisions on, it's not going to be the actual risk, it's going to be their perception of risk. So you need to think about how people perceive different things. And we're all like that. And the way we perceive different aspects, the elements that we're going to base our decisions on, are informed by a set of values. And what I'm saying is, in many cases, whether for an energy transition or whether for adapting to climate change impacts, we're reaching a stage where the scale of the efforts that have to be made are so large that we're not going to be able to do little things that are going to adjust on the margin. We're going to have to, do bigger things. And for that, we need to have projects that are kind of playing out along our values. Otherwise, people are not going to be on board. That's what
Right.
I'm trying to say.
And that's very clear. But the question remains, to what extent
Is
does
this
culture get in the way rather than facilitate the global movement that you're talking about?
That's something that I still don't know the answer to, honestly. And scholarly, I don't think that's something we understand very well. My sense is that it's not that culture gets in the way, it's that culture brings color to the type of solution or the shape of solutions that need to take place in. And there is no right or wrong on that. It's just, how we've decided to live as part of organized groups.
So, Diego, you're nodding.
Yes, and I would say, I mean, I'm Harvard trained, so I will refer to some professors, but one of the key elements there is Putnam, the whole idea of social capital. So that's part of it. And the second element is that when you have that space, and this is, I'm just going to quote somebody, the special envoy for climate change of Norway. I was talking to him about something, and he said, well, how you guys manage to do all these things? And he said, well, it's because we trust our government. So we don't mind the taxes.
Here is Canadians.
We as Norwegians, he was saying, we as Norwegians, we trust our governments. When he say put the mask, we trust it. When he say pay the taxes, we did it. And we say have the electric cars, we did it. So it's something there in terms of how much you trust your institutions. That seems to me that is an element. And you trust your institutions if you trust each other. and so those two things seems to go into connected with Putnam, and maybe it gives you the scholarly paper that you need to be able to have the solution for that.
I'm curious, Nazmul, trust in Bangladesh?
So, yes, in some situation it really worked. In some situation, probably it didn't work as expected. So going back to my program, I mentioned at some point, especially deploying clean energy in the rural areas where people had to make upfront investment. That was a big trust decision because in many cases, I mean, interestingly, I did reach out to personally in many of those areas. Many people thought that the solar, it is a magic box, and like the moment people sell it and come out of the house, it will not work. Because they never were exposed to electricity. We had to think about the context that producing electricity from sunlight was like magical for them. So it's like they never saw it before. But we had to bring in, and thank you for bringing the word of institutional trust. So we had to bring the institutional trust that is it called we are government. So if it doesn't work, we make sure that you get the warranty or like all the services that you need. So that we needed to communicate that trust to the rural people who did not have enough education or like information to trust to that new technology. So trust definitely did play a great role in terms of mass dissemination of this program. But that probably did not work out very well in some other areas where, for example, now in terms of the procurement of large IPPs, we do not still follow a very competitive bidding process. It is still very unsolicited, a little bit of unstructured, and sometimes there are confidence issue within the private sector or the foreign direct investors, whether like the policies which are supported now, whether that will continue in the future years, making sure the investment that the government is willing to track now will be still like profitable or attractive like 10 years down the line in terms of the incentive that's there now. So not enough disclosure is making people question whether they can like trust in the system for a long period of time. So I would say it's the kind of mixed experience that we had in the country.
So I'm curious, and this is shifting gears perhaps a bit, but we've already touched on aspects of it. Bangladesh, we know, is a country very much at risk to almost immediate climate change, right? You focus on migration. The kind of situation that Bangladesh is facing is going to generate migration if it hasn't already, right? It sounds like you've already got an answer to that. Diego, you've worried about security issues. We talked briefly about migration and Canada and the southern border of the U.S. with Mexico, and you said the U.S. southern border, right, with Mexico affects Canada. It's our concern just as much as it is yours. So Can we talk a bit about population flows under these circumstances and how that factors into the response that I think we all agree needs to happen, but that you've been very specific about?
I'll start. One of the typically the question of climate-driven migration, the way it's talked about in the media, you probably have heard this idea of like flows of billions of peoples, or at least millions of peoples being forced typically across borders due to climate risk. What we see empirically is actually quite different. We don't see really huge changes in numbers. We see changes in composition. That means we see increased flows of migration under climate stress in some places and decreased flows in some others. Why? Because migration is costly, it requires resources, and often what climate stress does is that it depletes resources. And so you end up in situations where you have people who perhaps would like to move but just don't have the means to do so anymore because they've been faced with climate stress. So that's one element of it. The other element of it, which is something that I hinted at prior and which is very relevant as well in the case of Bangladesh, is that it's not necessarily the case that people move out of harm's way. They might move, but they might move to other places where they might find themselves, equally exposed or exposed to different risks. We might think, for instance, that a community or household that wants to leave a place where they're facing a drought, a severe drought, or a severe heat wave might want to move to a big city. Most of the mega cities, especially in the global south, are in coastal areas, and there they might find themselves exposed to sea level rise or to coastal flooding or to other types of risks that might be different from where they came from, but it doesn't mean that they're in a better situation, even strictly climate-wise. It doesn't necessarily mean that they might have, more resources to deal with whichever risk they're facing. So the point being, there is an outsized emphasis on numbers of people moving or not moving. I think that's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is what's the nature of the movement and what happens to people when they get there, what happens to people who stay behind. And that's kind of how you want to frame the policy conversation. And Bangladesh in that case is often thought of as kind of the ground zero for climate-related migration, again, because it is so exposed and so densely populated. I will say that the Bangladeshi government over the past few decades has already done, significant efforts that, have been praised by many other countries, including through, disaster preparedness. So this morning, one of the speakers mentioned the huge hurricane that happened in the 70s. One of the big consequences of that, the Bangladeshi government was very effective at installing, very technologically simple systems for, preventing or, telling people, be careful, a hurricane is happening, a cyclone is happening, and that has really significantly, installed bunkers and, shelters in places along the coast, and that has significantly reduced the number of people who have been exposed to flooding, or people have had a shelter to go to when, when the cyclones hit, and that has been, granted with like a really significant gratitude for people in the sense that they have had a way to kind of protect themselves from extreme events.
Yeah. If I may, I'm shaped by security, and so you have to always be prepared for the worst. And a great fireman that never has to deal with the most horrible fire is a happy fireman, but still a capable fireman. And one of the things that happened here is that I do prepare for the worst. So I will disagree a tiny bit in terms of what you mentioned, because if we have the progression, this is exponential geometrical progression in terms of the situation with climate change, we will have extraordinary situations that will force extraordinary flows of people. And that is a problem that will be of direct impact for the whole of North America. We have Central America right now, which we know about it through the political dimension, the exchanges, the institutionality, Bukele and all these things, Nicaragua. But there is a big phenomenon related to climate change happening in Central America. It's called the dry corridor. I mean, things are not growing there. People are moving because the land doesn't produce the food that it needs to produce. Piece one. Piece two, we used to have something called the Darien Gap, a bit of jungle between Colombia and Panama. Nothing will go through that. People are moving at a scale they've never seen before through it. And it's just the trickle. Before the trickle, then you have the flow. And when you have the flow, you have the massive influx. And I think that if things change, we might see major movements of population from South and Central America onto these areas. And also, I have to say, and prepare as well for inflows within the United States. Parts of the United States might not be livable part of the year or the year round. And I was discussing with some Australians yesterday about this. The possibilities of inflows and internal displacement within countries in North America are huge. There was a lady in Alaska saying that they're losing a lot of the coastal areas up in the north. In our case, in Canada, there are places that are no longer insurable because of that. People will have to move in those areas. But if we have those kind of situations that hopefully will not happen, but might happen, what are you going to do when you have millions at the borders, okay? And millions is really millions. You don't stop this. You have to figure out a better solution than this.
You have a couple to offer us?
Well, one of the things that I can say is that when you cannot resist it, you have to become more permeable, and permeability is part of the thinking behind here. Every human born in the planet has a claim to human dignity. And part of human dignity is basically you have the right to look for a better life for yourself. The frameworks that we have in place, and now I'm going a little bit idealistic, but it's also true. The claims that we have for the frameworks that we have for the management of migration are restrictive and don't correspond to what happens in reality. People move, and what we need to do is to have a managed, well-integrated management of this kind of flow. There is an international institution called the International Organization for Migration. They don't say, don't move. They say, let's have a well-managed migration process. And I think we need to start preparing for a well-managed migration process because of climate change, because of frameworks, because of accidents, because of everything. We need to have processes to ensure that what's going to happen is well-managed, but it will happen.
And are you seeing that kind of intervention, this particular organization aside? I mean, aside from your casual conversations, are official discussions happening about how to manage at the global scale the kinds of migrations that you anticipate?
By trickles, yes.
Yeah, at this point, if you look at international institutions, the one thing that the focus seems to be on are on people who would move across borders as a result of climate risk. It doesn't mean that that's a chunk of situations that's being taken care of, and it just means that that's what the conversations are about. There is no very clear solution at this point. We can talk about something called the Global Compact for Migration, which is a non-binding framework to deal with climate, with all types of international migrations, including climate-related. The Paris Agreement has something on mobility, but it's, at this point, from what I can tell, really more of ongoing conversations and not very clear processes that are being put in place. Where I think, without negating what Diego just said, where I think there is a lack of emphasis is first on people who are going to move just within countries, which is expected to be the bulk of people moving primarily for climate reasons, and on people who end up being in situations where they just don't have the means to move anymore. Those are people, what we're seeing already, that are not at all visible from a political standpoint. It doesn't mean that they're doing well. It doesn't mean that their level of vulnerability is not high, but they're not part of the conversation at this point.
That's very true. I mean, you don't have thousands of small babies and elderly people crossing the Darien Gap. It's a specific type of people that can go walk through the whole of Central America in 3 months. So that has a definition in terms of who moves. But the second element is that if we continue with halfway denial, halfway wishful thinking in terms of what's going to happen, we won't be taking care of what's really going to happen. We need to have integrated processes in which we accept that there's going to be a major realignment of population, one way or the other, and we might as well do it in a way in which we all kind of ensure that it leads to something positive instead of being just a force for instability. In the case of Bangladesh, you had the warning signals at the time of this big situation, and they led to a preparation and disaster management capacities. Okay, when you had the big tsunami 2005 all over Southeast Asia, it led to a major realignment of capacities to respond. I was a humanitarian officer with the UN in the 2001, 2010. The systems, the coordination, the processes, the assumptions were not the same as they are now. And I say that we can take a page from that group to prepare for climate change. Because as it stands, climate change is not considered to be a humanitarian disaster yet. But that kind of response preparation, the kind of disaster preparedness is essential and copy-pasted onto this because we're going to have it in the future. One thing that happens in the case of Central America, and you asked me for a specific solution, most of the international action, most of the bilateral action is about how to contain, how to make sure that people don't move from point A to point B. What can I give you so that you can keep them there? And it's the same thinking in the European Union, unfortunately. They have plenty of agreements with Libya and places like that. Just don't let me see it, keep them there, don't make sure they don't come here. And the Mediterranean is a graveyard, is a human tragedy in the making day to day. Central America, it is as well. Rapes, traffic, drugs, all sorts of things are happening in a way that at a scale that we don't know, we don't hear. We need to have a properly managed process, accepting the reality that because of climate change, the world is going to be completely redesigned.
Well,
Yeah, so it scares me, honestly speaking, to think in that line. But I think from the perspective of Bangladesh, we have more to deal with other than just climate-related migration. We also have a lot of political migration to deal with. Especially, many of you know that there is this border issue with Myanmar. I mean, and we have like 1 million additional refugees flowing into a country which is already overpopulated. So what I think we need to look into is more from a regional perspective. I think none of the countries, especially in the emerging economies with a lot of population, can deal with massive climate-related migration all by themselves. Definitely not Bangladesh. There are short-term measures that we have taken, learning from the past, which has resulted into like less catastrophic events, despite having like large typhoons and cyclones, like not that much of human life loss that we had in the past. But I think these are like, we are only like kind of nudging the climate-related migration. I mean, none of the countries are really facing to that extent that what will really happen when the 3-meter rise in sea level will displace 1/3 of the population of the country. I mean, none of the countries, especially in our region, are prepared, considering that kind of major things, but that is a harsh reality. I mean, that seems like it's not really far. We are living in the climate change. I mean, it will not surprise me if in our lifespan we see major things happen and which will demand major climate-related displacement. And I think the regional integration, as you mentioned, that we need to redefine the problem and redefine our regional integration so that we don't need to deal with this on a country-by-country basis. So we can deal with it, accepting it as a global problem, more of a regional approach, and share our resources, do the best that we can, because at that point in time when such migration happens, I believe none of us will be safe for a long time, at least.
but again,
given the context.
would that readjustment take place in a public-private sense, recognizing the broader public that you've offered us, Diego? Is that what, or are we just talking nation states talking to nation states?
I think the public-private element can still be there. It is already happening, especially when Hélène, you mentioned that adaptation that our country has done, and that though we often hear that adaptation is probably not very feasible on a private sector basis. It's more mitigation that private sector is more interested in. But the Green Climate Fund issue that you mentioned, they also provide a lot of funding, not just in terms of credit, in terms of grant, subsidies, guarantees for adaptation-related activities, which could be channeled initially through the private sector to build in adaptation so that the short-term climate consequences can be better tackled by bringing the private sector. So that will make that intervention faster once that fund flow comes in, and make those countries to take better preparation for climate-related activity, but on the longer term also. So thinking the climate-related migration, one challenge of many of the developing countries is that their development across the country is not uniform. So they are focused on few metropolitan cities, and the rest of the countries are relatively there are quite a difference in equitable adjustment of the development activities within the country. So the public-private partnership can play a big role in terms of making sustainable cities within the country boundary, so that if such migration situation happens, everyone does not crowd in the metropolitan cities, which in most cases are already very, very overcrowded.
Right.
Rather, it is relatively well distributed by bringing private capital in developing sustainable cities throughout the country, so that at least it can be better managed, as it's not a catastrophe right away.
Just want to say two quick things on that. You ask public-private partnerships can make it happen, and I say public and private equal market. And markets, in the absence of a open conflict, is how we mobilize resources in every society. So I think the solutions are there within the public and the private partnerships, one side pushing the other, one side facilitating the access of the other, and moving it through finance. That's what it is. The Marshall Plan was a public-private partnership, and it has a major effect. Reconstruction plans, in wherever you want to see them, you have public and private engagements. So it's always going to be that way. It's important to ensure that we maintain a situation at the degree of stability in which we can use market mechanisms to make things happen. Because if we don't have that stability, then we have to engage in a different type of money distribution, money implementation kind of approach.
Listening to Nazmul, I heard the public sector incentivizing the private sector to engage and then produce a public-private partnership. Is it not conceivable that the private sector would incentivize itself? And your H&M example may be the first indication that that's possible. And I see Diego shaking his head. This is not a good sign.
So yes, I mean, it's happening, but as I mentioned, this is in the mitigation space. So what H&M is doing, like many other private developers, is doing intervention by reducing the climate footprint or the CO2 footprint or the emission footprint in the future. So against commercial production facilities. But the adaptation is not profitable. I mean, adaptation is, as we all know, that it's making people comfortable that if climate change happens, if there is a change in crop pattern that you need to go to, you go there. So there is no money as such in the mechanism which will make private sector very interested, other than short-term intervention of creating bunkers, which is a construction contract, but not really a private sector role to that extent. So, but there can be interesting proposition. I mean, there were some pilots undertaken in our country also. For example, due to the cyclonic nature, we build lots of bunkers throughout the coastal belt in the country, but cyclone doesn't happen every other day. It's like once in 10 years. So these facilities, first of all, it's a big administrative burden for the government to maintain those in anticipation of that cyclone that might happen like once in 10 years. And also, what is the use of them until that cyclone situation happens? So there is some intervention converting them into makeshift schools until that situation happens, so that and bring the private sector in, that you run the schools in those areas, make it a commercial facility, in lieu of it, maintain the facility, and also use it as a facility, as a cyclone shelters when situation such happens. Right. So bring in private sector, maybe not for the construction of it, but more for day-to-day operational expense bearing. So just one thought process that this could happen. On a bigger scale, this can definitely happen by developing sustainable cities, which will make the country better prepared in case such migration happens. People are relatively dispersed throughout the country, so that no major concentration happens only around the metropolitan cities, making it a disaster at that point in time for the country to manage.
So sustainable cities or sustainable metropolises here means depopulating centers. Is that what I'm hearing?
Better planning.
Yeah, better planning.
Better planning, better implementation. You take an earthquake in Japan, 7 point something in the Richter scale. no major things happen. You take the same earthquake in Haiti, 7 point something, major disaster. Concentration, vulnerability, lack of resilience, bad planning. Basically, you build houses that fall apart like a house of cards. People don't have the capacity to have an option. When he's referring to not necessarily the populating, but having a system that is more sustainable, because if we are spread all over, whenever the hit comes, it doesn't kill everybody. And that is related to the fact that we take population and design measures that increase resilience. You know, having this kind of urban concentration, if it's well planned, is good. But if it's not well planned, we just basically all waiting there like sitting ducks for something that's going to be bad. And that comes in terms of stimulus, possibilities, the kind of loans that he's able to modulate through the system. If people have an incentive to be not necessarily in the center of DACA because there are possibilities of employment, engagement, and things like that far away, then the whole thing works. It's just basically public-private, equal market, make it happen before it's too late.
And you've fallen quiet here.
Yeah, no, I mean, the conversation is getting to a point that is really important, and where private and public partnerships have a key role, and that's, the whole notion of urbanization and urban management, which is really about designing infrastructures that are dimensioned for the number and the type of people who live there in terms of like water, sewage, roads, and whatnot. It's not necessarily the case that out of today, all cities, whether in the global south or in the global north, are, functional and have infrastructures that meet the needs of people. It's definitely the case that in a context of increasing climate change, we want to think kind of dynamically about how we're thinking about urban planning and management, about how we're thinking about adapting the, dimensions of, key infrastructures in a way that can accommodate, a bigger influx of people who might need to move into the city for whichever reasons. So that kind of gets to the crux of it, which is really, we want to be flexible in our decision-making processes, and public-private partnerships are arguably a good way to do that, in a way that allows us to, adapt our decisions, as conditions change over the years.
Yeah.
And so regional or the local specificity.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, there's a lot on the table. Questions? Aram.
Hi, Iram Sattar. I'm an alum of the law school, and I think about water and climate change. This came up in some of the comments, and Leigh has sort of picked up on it also, climate migration. As Diego said, there's only a particular kind of person who's able to trek up, right? So it's deeply physically taxing. But there are also massive reports, and maybe Hélène can sort of discuss this. This had come up earlier about disability. That there are a lot of, there's now very good evidence that we have that, especially because of the wall that's been built and people are really having to jump and climb over, that there are major spinal injuries, brain injuries. This is not easy, even for somebody who's fit, to do this. So what about that cost of increasing disability in people who are really trying to come to make a better life for themselves? If someone could talk about where that fits.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you're raising is really that, the people who migrate are those who are able to do so, and being able to do so can mean different things. There's definitely a health component to it, whichever you want to call it, of being physically able to do that in the case of the, Central American to US border for sure. The question of who is able to move and who, how does the journey take place, that's also something that I think we're not yet thinking enough about, which is that climate change itself is making the journey potentially even more difficult. Yeah. Conditions of drought, conditions of heat, depending on how long you want to go through, where you need to go through, that itself might affect the journey. And we actually have pretty good data on, southern US border crossing, and how there's actually very interesting studies that are looking at where people cross depending on the weather conditions while they've made the journey. And what you're saying is very clear links between, depending on whichever stress you have to go through, where you're going to choose to cross the border. So that's kind of, one of the ways in which we can think the question of, who is able to move, where they're able to go through. And definitely getting back to the disability question of, not being physically able to use migration as, you know, one of the sets of choices that you might have in front of you to decide what's the better choice for yourself and for your family, that's something that has profound, you know, equity considerations, and that's something that I think we're not yet talking enough about in terms of the solution space.
May I say one thing? Is when 9/11 happened, one of the less known consequences of that was that there was going to be a major revamping of migration and immigration processes at the time. And because of the whole thing, it was put on standby and it never happened. But think of it, the Filipinos have a very interesting management of their migration system. So people go and work somewhere, but there is this interesting banking element. There is processes in which you can save back home. And so you are an expat somewhere and you send money home, and at one point you return. One of the elements there is that, and I say that as a Canadian who, my parents decided to send me to Canada when I was a kid. When people migrate, they migrate not necessarily because of the weather or because of one place looks better, it's because they're seeking better governance. And because climate change destroys the conditions in one place, you go on somewhere else where you can have the governance that allows you to thrive or at least to survive. That's what they're looking for. And so if we create mechanisms by which people can bring their capital, human capital, work and do things, and then go back and maintain that. If we create good governance in both sides, you don't necessarily have to expect everybody to move at once. And do we have banking systems in which you can have people do the work and then send back and save the money back in capital and all these things in Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras? We don't have those in place. The other thing with that element is that we have to accept the fact that migration capitals is an important thing. You know, diaspora pays. And it happens despite the fact that we don't allow that to happen. You know, Western Union is the winning on most of these things. But it shouldn't just be Western Union. It should be co-ops. It should be credit capacities. It should be places in which Guatemalans in Boston can get together and facilitate the integration of a project that is connected to the Green Climate Fund in the middle of Guatemala. Why is not that happening? I mean, there are plenty of tools that we have at hand that could facilitate these kind of things.
Peter.
Well, Diego's comment about governance leads into my question, which is really Diego's question about governance, or comment about governance, leads into my question, which is a tale of two American states. The American state that is least vulnerable to climate change is Vermont. And the American state that is most vulnerable to climate change is Florida. In Vermont, and I was in the Vermont Senate, we passed legislation to impose California emission standards on our cars. Increased costs, almost no complaints. I bought a car in Florida, and I said, when do I have to get my car inspected? And the dealer looked at me and said, we don't have inspection in Florida. So Vermont is passing standards to save Florida from the consequences of climate change. Now, I wonder if you could comment further about why it is that in the same country, United States, incidentally, probably their migration from good governance to bad governance, but why it is that one state like Vermont will address these issues even though the cost of addressing them is high and the problem is relatively low, and another place won't address it even though the cost is high. We can understand the case of Bangladesh, where the cost of climate change is high and Bangladesh is addressing it. But what about these other places? Maybe it's a rhetorical question, but I'd welcome your comments.
I mean, in this way, I think the U.S. is a little bit of an outlier in the degree in which the climate change issue has been politicized in this country. Whichever level of development countries have reached, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. is kind of an outlier on that scale. And once the issue has become politicized, climate change is, indirect and invisible enough that you can make all kinds of claims along those lines, and reaching the dynamics that you're describing. There is another part of it, which is that how individuals make decisions. Again, it gets back to the point I was making, which is based on perceptions of risk. And you've probably have seen, each time there is a storm or something, an interview of a Floridian in front of their house, their feet in the water, saying, no, everything is fine, there is no problem, I don't need to move. And it feels a little bit like a cognitive dissonance. But that gets to the point that the way people make decisions is not based on a rational assessment of risk. It's based on their perceptions of what their risks are, what they might gain in going somewhere else, etc. So that's kind of a halfway response to your concern. But yeah.
A year before the invasion of Ukraine, I was invited to give a presentation in Ukraine about climate change. And I always say two things. One is the famous thing that climate change is cognitively diffuse. You don't see it, it happens trickle by trickle. And so that makes that if it had a face, you will probably be more geared evolutionarily to deal with that. The second element is the analogy of the frogs in the boiling water is very good for this, because we won't notice it until it's a bit too late. And the question is, what can you do so that the frogs have a better governance, so that they understand that they're boiling? And what will help the frogs be able to get out of their pot before it's too late? Those are the two things that makes me always wonder. And I'm being part of a system, the North American system, in which I coexist with these phenomena, with views of the world, views of markets, view of freedom, view of governance that are correlated. I mean, you're from Vermont, I'm from Quebec. And so I live with the Vermont situation every day. I drive by every day. My wife is American, from a Cuban-American family. So, I mean, the reality is there. And what I hear out of my mother-in-law doesn't compute with what I see in Miami, nor what I understand in Montreal. And that's people living in their governance systems. So it's about doing something in terms of the political engineering that we have in place.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. That was very interesting, and particularly the piece about cities, and I'd like to ask about that. My name's Bob Pell. I'm a visiting fellow at the Growth Lab and Kennedy School, and I'm an urban planner by background, not an economist, so I'm a sort of outlier in the lab. And I've worked in urban planning in a lot of countries over many years, and the piece that I'm working on now and I'm interested in is that interface between climate change, urbanization, and the problems of economic growth, particularly in second-tier cities. And what you just mentioned about the need for people to come together to solve that. And I'm desperately looking for best-in-class, best examples of where government, non-profits, community, and maybe philanthropy, where somehow, is there any example that you can give where that coalition has happened at a second-tier city level to get a sustainable solution to solve all of those problems together? Because I haven't found one yet, but if somebody's got one.
All right. So unfortunately, I cannot give you that magic solution as yet. But it happened, maybe not with all the parties involved as yet. So I think the definition of sustainable city also varies depending on the perspective you're talking about, that what element from a climate perspective is really important for that particular city to adopt. But in general, I believe a sustainable city should be one that will give affordable housing solution, that will look into the possible climate intervention that might be happening and to address those situations, and to adopt all the up-to-date climate technology that could be in an affordable manner can be adopted. But in my country, that is a big problem that we are still struggling with. We haven't seen much. But I have seen some examples in India where they are working on sustainable city concept, bringing in a lot of energy efficiency concept, bringing in a lot of water saving concept, and also building houses in such manner with such materials so that it can tackle the foreseeable climate-related challenges that the city might face in the future. So some cities in India might act as good reference for you to look into. So yeah, I think that would be my response.
And you could name a couple.
I don't have anything right away, but I'll be able to communicate later. Yeah.
Kimball.
I'm fascinated by this most recent question and your answer, because, as well as the foregoing comments, because what you've really described is a need to have a progressive evolution and sustainable and maintenance of enough trust in societal structures, whatever the culture may be, so that solutions can be defined, accepted by people, and kept in place for long enough for action to happen. The enabling environment of policy is necessary. The private sector will not act, and I'll speak about that in my rant this afternoon. But the problem is a social evolution question which has to be answered over time, progressively, and still have progress made, which won't go into reverse. Right. So the critical question is, if you have an uneducated population and perhaps political class, how do you get decisions made and gradually educate people so that you can make progress? So if you have a low trust society, which Fukuyama or Huntington or whatever would describe, nobody trusts government, and the electorate is not educated. You can't do anything. So what are the steps of creation of an adequate critical mass, sustainable critical mass of shared values, to use one of the words that's been up there, and knowledge, and a shared agreed base of understanding of what questions to ask and what solutions must be taken by society over the long term?
May I say something about that? When the gentleman that's working on urban planning asked the question, you asked the question in a way that you were asking, if I got it correctly, on a technocratic, positive deviance, good examples kind of approach, as if the solution is happening somewhere. But with your question, you opened the door for something that I always say, and for me it's very important. The social narrative is essential. It is essential. It's how we create the story that we get us all together. So for all those that know this, it's Marshall Gans, right? And that famous little thing that gets you going, the story of mine, the story of us, and the story of the future, the story of us together. I don't remember exactly what it is, but for me, I took the course and it didn't go well for me, but I understood one thing, which is the social narrative is a great mobilizer and is quite permeable to high levels, low levels of education. And we just basically need to have a discourse, and we have to shape it. It's a work of all of us to shape it in a way that gets people going, whether you have high school or a PhD. And we are working in a context in which some of these social narratives are creating what we have today. The one about distrust of the government, the one about polarization, but we just live in the empty space for the narrative that got all the Vermontians to have a proper mobilization for their preparation in the future. Why, if they're able to get it, they cannot transpose the same thing into other parts of the United States? Because you have one thing here that's quite amazing. If you go to Belgium, what the Flemish-speaking people are doing doesn't translate to what the Francophones, the Wallons are doing. And I'm in Montreal. What happens in Toronto is miles away from what's happening in Toronto, in Montreal, Toronto, English-speaking, Vancouver. But in a way, you have a capacity here to have more or less the same discourse in Florida, Seattle, Los Angeles, or Vermont. You respond to the same media culture in a way. You have a lot of difference in many regional stuff, but Americans live in a country that reflects America, right?
So,
It's
Diego,
unique.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This is Patty, sitting up in the middle of the center section, is shaking her head vigorously
Right.
as you talk about this unifying narrative.
Yeah.
And I am absolutely sympathetic to Marshall Gantz's formula, right, in the story of now. But how many different stories of now are we dealing with in this country? Forget about the rest of the
That's
world.
true. That's also true.
That's an issue, and that's the question that Kimball is asking. That is, is there some truth somewhere underlying all these narratives? Because everyone is talking about story now, and they're all different stories.
It's a valid
And
question.
we need, and this is why I sort of pressed you earlier, Hélène, on the idea of forward human progress, right? Can we even conceive of that now?
Conceive what?
A unified approach to climate change.
But do you need a unified approach? I think
Diego
that's-
is saying yes.
I mean, you can need a kind of, overall narrative, but a lot of the solutions are going to be,
Very
especially
local.
when it comes to adaptation, they're going to be very local. It doesn't mean that it works. I mean, the case of New York is kind of telling, right? What happens in New York is that you have to have the city and then the state and then the federal level that have to agree together on how, in that case, the example I'm thinking of is designing some kind of barrier to protect New York against sea level rise. That level of agreement, to your point, keeping a level of agreement among different levels of governance in a sustained way across the changes in administration at various levels has proven not very successful, which is why I was that was the example that came to mind when you asked your question, and I was like, that doesn't sound like a very successful example to me. But I don't see a way forward if we're not going to be able to kind of, in the case of New York or in the case of any other local context, building a narrative about what do people who live there, have an attachment to this place, want to do in the future, now that, we're starting to get a level of understanding of what the future might look like.
Nazmul.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment. So I still feel that I know that it's probably like too many stories being told simultaneously, and for people like to really prioritize which story to do really, it's often a challenge, both personally and professionally also. But I also do not see a way out. I think we need to keep on sharing the good examples. We need to bring in people to share their voice, so that at some point the authorities find it an important enough story to really act upon. So I think all the good, we should keep on sharing the good examples so that Vermont was doing to rest of the states of America, and like let people in the respective state talk about let the people decide what is priority for them. And I don't think a uniform solution will eventually work out, because every city, I mean, like forget the country, so are so different in terms of the adaptation mitigation plan that is suitable for that particular city, and that only the people who lives in that particular city knows the best, that what really works out for them economically, technologically. So let the people's voice be heard by letting them know what's happening in the rest of the part, what good examples are happening from which they can take example and implement if they think that's suitable, and let the people's voice rise up to the authority level so that they are compelled to take action upon.
Come back to that, I suspect, this afternoon. Yes, Jim.
Thank you. There's so many wonderful issues and problems that have surfaced here. In answer to the gentleman who asked the question about urbanization, Bruno Carvalho here at Harvard may be able to help answer that. I have a vague memory of a city in South America, is it Curicambo? Curitiba, that did wonderful work in many respects on transportation and planning and so forth. So that may be a second-tier example that is possible. I have a question about finance, which I ask from some ignorance, and about public-private incentivization going back and forth. It's pretty clear that some private companies are not much incentivized. Professor Henderson here at the business school said that when she talks with them to try to incentivize them, they always seem surprised when she tells them that first they are going to have to spend money, which they don't want to do because they aren't sure whether they're going to get a return on it. But she then tries to convince them that if they spend money, the end result later will be good for them. Then we have companies like, I think, JBS, which was just recently brought to the courts in New York because the courts, the prosecution says they were lying to the public about their climate goals, that their climate goals were completely fictitious and impossible to meet. But I have a question that, in my mind, crosses the line of public and private, and that is the enormous amount of money some places in the world that are in pension funds and in sovereign wealth funds. Arguably, these are private, but in many respects they are public because many of the workers involved are hired by the government. The great Japanese pension fund, which has recently changed its climate objectives, or the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association in the United States, which has not changed its climate objectives, for example. How can we get these vast investment sums to alter their gyroscope?
Oh, me? Oh, all right. You wanted to-
And I go after.
Interestingly, I'm very happy you raised the question. So I was just discussing the very same topic yesterday with a professor at the University of Maryland who was willing to bring some private capital in especially the institutional fund that you mentioned, the pension funds, to the global south in countries which are apparently not very bankable but are very interested to do climate-related interventions. So the sad truth that I have learned over the years is that despite so much capital lying within these institutional funds, be it the pension funds and the insurance capital, they are still not, I understand their rationale, so they are not still in a position to invest in a country which are not considered as investment grade. So, and these are the countries which demand most of the funding because they do not have otherwise access of a lot of private capital the way investment grade countries have. One solution could be to have a different approach. Many of these pension funds are also managed by the private sector who are also not authorized to make that investment given the type of agreement they have with the pension fund. So there is no easy solution to that. I mean, it's hard, and also it still has the same problem what you started with, that they need to spend money first and they will come later. So where do they get the original fund? And if they get the original fund, what would be the incentive to go for refinancing that by another fund unless that is significantly subsidized? And that gives them incentive both in terms of probably a very much longer tenor or in terms of subsidized interest rate, which is also not the case of the pension fund. They expect market-based financing, of course, due to their obligation with their beneficiary that they also need to provide them suitable return. Makes sense, but essentially a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah.
So they would like to support, but the conditionality that they have in mind are not sufficient. So we were discussing one possible solution, not tested as yet, and also not that all countries can follow that, to bring in some public sector intervention. So if this is a good project in the private sector where the private sector fund from the pension fund can be mobilized, whether there could be some degree of guarantee arrangement done by the public sector, maybe from the public sector of that country, or probably some of the DFI products that could be developed to give some comfort, some first loss guarantee to those pension funds so that they can go beyond those investment rating done by the rating agencies and can still invest to some extent to these countries or companies which will start the process and they can innovate in the way as once they start. So some thought process that we had, but I don't have a very good solution as yet.
Thank you, Nazmul. Jacob?
Yes. I think actuarial science is an important tool for climate change because our system works as if market is really reflecting the world that we have out there, and it doesn't. There are so many costs, and I have an ecological expert here in front of me, so apologies, because I simplify for the point of making it available for policymakers and decision makers. But basically, as it stands now, our system, a tree standing costs less than a tree down, because you cut it, you make it into something. That is a logic that's a little bit strange, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So do we have a system that really reflects all the costs? And if so, if it was able to do it, then can the decision makers in those trust funds take the right approach? Well, element one. Element two, intergenerational equity. Every teacher that has the money in their pension fund might be interested in ensuring that the grandkids and the kids of the grandkids get to enjoy some sort of decent life. Well, what would you do if you say your pension fund is eating away from that future from your children? It will force decisions. Those are the things that need to be available, need to be made available to those that vote in those decision funds. And those, the pension fund of the teachers in Norway has taken certain decisions because they managed to be able to transpose that complex reality into something that becomes binary decisions for those members of that fund. The pension fund in Quebec takes some of those decisions because you get pressure from society to do it. So how can we facilitate reality becoming available for those who are in the decision-making board of these funds so that they take into account that having a future is part of a good return?
I come from the trade of psychology, and in my first response to you talking about Germany was that they were right from Chernobyl right into Germany, and that may have driven. But what I see in this country is, we got all these gun murders. It doesn't seem to change the dime. The oil patch places that were presented this morning, they're not changing anything. They're all, and so I'm wanting to think that some trauma like might happen to Florida or New Orleans, would change things. But in this country, it doesn't seem to. Our bandwidth is so short, and to how do we engage for this kind of cultural shift that Diego, yeah, was trying to talk about.
So you're looking for change when the evidence suggests that there is no change.
That people are the initial response is yes, and then and maybe 10, 15 years later they can sue one TV commentator for lying about the murders of those children in a school, and there's a financial settlement there, but that's not a global change.
So the three of you have 30 seconds to answer this.
I'll go first. I guess a beginning of solution, and you're probably very well aware of this, is, behavioral science shows that people change their minds when they're talked to by people who they trust and people who shares their values. And so one of the big things that you can do, I had a colleague back when I was in grad school who was evangelical Christian, and she was also an atmospheric scientist. She did her PhD in climate science, and she spent a lot of time talking in her church communities about climate science and in ways that she felt were palatable to her community. And she was obviously a trusted messenger for her community because she was a part of it. I think we need a lot more of that, especially in this country where a lot of discourses around this issue are very separate. We need a lot more of trusted messengers. So one of the things I would say would be, identify your community where you can be a trusted messenger and try and talk to them. That's one of the big things we can do.
Go ahead then. Nazmul.
So I'll take 15 seconds and give my 15 to Diego. So, all right. So I think for me it would be led by example. So I think someone within the big picture, be it a state, be it a county, will have to show some good example and show it to the rest of the world, or at least rest of the America, so that people can really take, and again, for me, it's very important that people's voice is heard, so that people have right information to decide on what is right and wrong for them, but by being exposed to the right example that is suitable for them to.
And you have seen such examples.
I have seen in my country context, as a, since we are like bringing also some example, so our good examples were seen by African countries. That's why they're adopting that. So in another scale, yes, some of those.
Good. Diego.
I think everything for human, not everything, a lot of things for humans go through here more than here. And another element that I find very interesting is that the most accepted convention internationally is the Convention of the Rights of the Child. You know, is the one in which Saudi Arabia agreed with the United States. That the United States is not a signatory, but others are. But it's one of the major funders for the convention. So, but one thing is, the intergenerational equity is an element, is a tool that we are not using enough. I mean, I have 4 kids. Okay. And I feel really emotional about the fact that their future is not going to be the same as mine. That is something that I think everybody in the political spectrum will share with me, because we all care about our children. That's the way we have to mobilize the world.
Thank you all three, especially on this last point. But throughout the panel, you contributed a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel.